Start the second half of this workshop day, going with the organizing committee of this day, who needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway. We're going to start with the duality project presented by Paola Ruffo, who's a researcher in the field of computer-aided literary translation. In 2022, she joined Ghent University as a Marie Curie postdoc fellow to work on the duality project, which stands for Developing User-Centered Approaches to Technical Innovation in Literary Translation. She's previously worked as an English-Italian freelance translator and a lecturer in translation technology at the University of Bristol. Paola, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Damian. Okay, can you all hear me well? Yeah, okay. Okay, so as Damian said, I'm a postdoc here at Ghent University, and for the past 2 years I've been working on the duality project, which I will be presenting some of the results of today. So as Damian already said in the introduction, duality stands for Developing User-Centered Approaches to Technological Innovation in Literary Translation, which is a very long title, and the reason why we have a fancy sounding acronym. But the main reason why I started this project, which is funded by the European Union and supervised by Professor Liebermack and Professor Joke Downs, is because I could see there was a discrepancy a couple of years ago between literary translators' realities and what was happening in academia and research on translation technologies. And so I was trying to kind of bring literary translators' voices back into the conversation, but of course, this is just a first step in that direction, and I'm more than welcome to hear any suggestions or questions after the presentation about how we can maybe do this better in the future. So the discrepancy is born out mainly of the fact that the literary translator toolkit looks a bit like this. So the average literary translator usually just uses a Word file to type the translation from a PDF file of the source text, internet search, just Google search, to search for any information, and an online dictionary. So these are the main kind of tools that a literary translator usually uses. However, the conversation surrounding automation in translation looks a bit more like this in the mainstream. I'm sure we've all seen all the big selling newspaper titles about ChatGPT stealing all of our jobs and what's going to happen to translation. And so, yeah, I noticed a discrepancy there. Of course, the project started before ChatGPT was even a thing, which is something that, yeah, we'll take into account. And at the same time, some people ask me sometimes, is this really happening in literary translation though? Literary translation is not really affected by these changes. You know, it's more creative, it's hard to do with machine translation, with automation. However, you can see here press release from March last year, for example, of the first fully AI-powered publisher. And at the same time, as was coming up in the discussion before in the chat as well, literary translation associations and translation associations in general are starting to take a stance in terms of these new technological changes and artificial intelligence in particular. But again, one could argue that machine translation is also powered by artificial intelligence. It's not just ChatGPT now. And you can see here on the screen some extracts from a manifesto from the European Council of Literary Translators Associations, where they kind of emphasize the importance of creativity in the profession and the fact that we shouldn't kind of give machines human traits. We shouldn't treat machines as if they're actually doing translation. And the way they put it is, machines are not translators, but translatoids. They do not translate, they generate textual material. And so they're kind of setting in stone the difference between what they consider translation and what we call machine translation. And then more recently, just last month, I think it was June 2024, the UK Institute of Translation and Interpreting published the Slow Translation Manifesto, which is kind of inspired by the slow food movement in response to the fast food movement. And what they're arguing is, again, that translation takes time. And so we shouldn't necessarily look for ways to make this faster, because being faster in literary translation might not necessarily be the good way to do translation. And the way they put it is, again, that a skillful translation requires time. And so we shouldn't aspire to saving as much time as possible. At the same time, the issue or the topic of translation, technological innovation in literary translation has entered the mainstream discourse as well. So you can see these two articles from The Atlantic and the other from The Guardian. They were published in January 2024 and March 2024, so very recently. And yeah, they also take into account research, they interview publishers, and it's kind of interesting to see the difference between when I studied this research, where this wasn't even really a topic that was taken seriously, especially when I was doing my PhD. We were talking about it the other day with the other presenters. Like I studied in 5-6 years ago, and people couldn't even imagine the word technology associated with literary translation. However, this is the situation now, and it's changing very rapidly. In terms of research has tended to focus primarily on machine translation post-editing, which again is the practice of starting with a machine translation output, and the literary translator's job is to edit that output until it reaches the quality that they desire. Some research in these areas found that, for example, post-editing can increase productivity up to 36%. However, there's also other research, and kind of what Damien was showing as well. There's always the other side of any discovery in this area, that translators always prefer translation from scratch. This famous term that we were discussing before. And I think here, like, it's just used to indicate, starting a translation without having a text already translated for you by a machine, put it in the most simple terms. And then at the same time, human translation has been found to have to produce higher reader engagement and having higher levels of creativity. In general, whenever a human is involved, there's higher levels of creativity. So that this means also in post-editing, but human translation without post-editing is always the most creative one. And post-editing causes a slight dampening of the translator's textual voice, which is again from the study from Kenya Winters that we've heard before this morning. And at the same time, literary translators, in terms of attitudes, they tend to use translation technology in very unusual ways, which means they don't necessarily use translation technology for the purpose that it was built for what the software engineer thought about when they were developing the tool, but they adapt it to their own very specific needs for literary translation. And this might include, for example, in a survey that I conducted, not for this project, but for a different project. Some of the translators were using machine translation to back translate things. So they would translate everything manually, like they would normally do, and then just put it back into the machine translation to check, for example, that they didn't miss any sentences, which might be something that happens quite often when you translate in Word. So things like that, like finding creative ways of using technology that is not necessarily what the technology was created for. And then they're either skeptical or indifferent towards technology. They're either saying, I don't think you can do a good job, or they just don't care. They say, it doesn't really concern me. Again, usually, and from these studies that are mentioned here. And then there's also lack of training or awareness of technology. So most translators don't really know what's out there, like what kind of tools they can use. But also they don't receive enough training, even if they wanted to, they don't know where to start to learn about using these tools. But then at the same time, more recently, like this year, a couple of years ago as well, researchers started to wonder, is this too much hype? Is the technology really that good, or are we kind of making it better than it is? And so there's statements that the machine translation is not of sufficient quality at the moment to produce standalone translations, and this is from the European Commission, among others. And then Hometown in 2023 reminds us that the particularity and complexity of literary translation have been underestimated. So we maybe are not looking at all the different characteristics of literary translation, or what makes a translation literary. And it's also worth mentioning some alternatives to post-editing. Some people are not focusing on post-editing only, but cut tools, which is what Damian was showing before. So things like Trados, which I will tell you more about because it's what I used in my experiments. And so they're exploring the potential of cut tools to enhance creativity, not necessarily to save time or to cut any costs, but just maybe to help the translator, as if what we were saying before, with other technology like online dictionaries, anything that might help the translator now make it more efficient, or looking for more adequate information. Cut tools might help, for example, in the case of Uder and Rothwell, for retranslation. So the way they work is usually you have a translation memory that reminds you of all the translation that you or somebody else did. And so if you're retranslating a text, it might be helpful to kind of have it there. It's like the way they put it is like a ghost of the old text. And so there's a lot going on. It's a very nascent field. There's not Well, there's a lot of work being done, but of course we have nothing that's conclusive. But there's so many aspects, as Dorothy was also saying this morning, there's so many different aspects that we need to look at the same time. And so, yeah, it's just, we're only getting started, basically. And this is where DLT comes in. So the main aims of the projects were to devise a technology-inclusive literary translation workflow, employing a user-led approach, so to involve literary translators as much as possible in the testing of technology. And then to assess to what extent computer-aided translation, so the CAT tools we were talking about just now, and machine translation post-editing can enhance literary translators' workflow, if at all. And again, so including CAT tools as well, instead of just post-editing, which is usually what is being done at the moment. And then to mediate a dialogue between literary translators and translation technology developers. So we had an industry partner that lent us one of the tools, and again, I will tell you more about this later. And one of the representatives from the company will also participate in the discussion later. And what I did to kind of achieve these aims was to ask professional literary translators to come in Ghent, at Ghent University, but also in Leiden, translators from the Netherlands. And the experimental session went something like this. We had a pre-task questionnaire to start the day, where I just asked some background information. And then I asked translators to translate 3 different short stories, each one in a different workflow. And the 3 workflows were just Microsoft Word, so having the source text in a PDF file, and then just translating in Word, which was used as the baseline, which is usually what most translators do, and online resources, so they could have access to Google, to internet search, to online dictionaries. The second workflow was a CAT tool. In this case, we used Trados 2022 with a glossary and a translation memory. The translation memory contained the rest of the book. So the book was a short story collection, and so all the book except the 3 short stories that were part of the experiment. And again, people could also use online resources in all 3 cases. And then the third workflow was a book translation platform from Nuance, which is the company we're collaborating with. And the book translation platform uses post-editing, so the translators were presented with a machine translated text, and then they had to post-edit the output. And then after the 3 tasks, I had a post-test questionnaire where I asked them about, to rank each workflow and to tell me their preferences. And then I interviewed each participant. And then in a second stage, just a couple of weeks ago, actually, I had some focus groups with some of the participants and a representative of the company. But that's, again, another stage of the process. Like today, I was focused more on the user testing and on the interviews. And the user testing consisted, well, the data was collected with keylogging software, in this case, InputLog. So I measured keystrokes and pauses to kind of determine cognitive and technical effort, and also how much time it took translators, so temporal effort as well. The text that we used are these 3. The 3 short stories are Rome, The Beautiful Girl in the Bookstore, and They Kept Driving Faster and Faster, and Outrun the Rain. I missed part of the title here, actually. But they're all from this short story collection called One More Thing by BJ Novak, which some of you might know as a comedian and actor. He was in The Office, the TV series. And so the texts are also very, they were very ironic. They contain a lot of puns, and some of them were funny, and a lot of language that looked simple at first, but then there was a lot of layers sometimes, depending on the story. And you can see more or less it was an average of 300 words each for each text. So we had, I had 24 participants. Now for the user testing, only 21 participants will be taken into account because we have problems with the keylogging files, but that's another story for another day. So the data you will see today is from 21 participants for the user testing, but for the interviews, I will take into account all 24. On average, they were 48 years old. We had 13 female participants, 8 male participants. And again, on average, they had 12 years of literary translation experience. The least experienced had only 1 year of experience, the most experienced had 43 years of experience in the business. And then 13 participants out of 21 had an academic qualification in translation, and 11 at postgraduate level. And then finally, 8 participants indicated that they had used computer-aided translation or post-editing before. And of these 8, 4 of them used it specifically for literary translation, because it's also worth to take into account that most literary translators also translate other things, more technical text, for example. And so they might have to use capitals, for example, in other branches of translation, but they might not necessarily do that in theory translation. So here's some graphs that look a bit confusing at first, but the first one I'm showing you is temporal effort, which just means how long it took each translator on average to translate each text. And you can see there's a lot of variability. So there's, some translators took not a lot of time, some translators took longer. But on average, we had 52 minutes with Word when translating one word, 45 minutes to translate a short story with Trados, and 43 minutes with post-editing with the book translation platform that I was mentioning before. So post-editing resulted in 17% less time than with Word, so an increase in productivity of 17%. The post-editing was the fastest for 12 participants, so more than half. And Word was the slowest workflow for 10 participants, so slightly less than half. Now, I also asked them in the post-test questionnaire to tell me a bit more about their perception. So I just said, how long do you think it took you? And they didn't know. I mean, of course, they were there, but we didn't measure time specifically at that time. And so these are just participants' perceptions on how long it took them. And you can see that 10 participants ranked post-editing as the fastest versus 12 actual participants that I measured were fastest with post-editing. And 7 participants ranked Word as the fastest versus just 2 actual participants that were faster with Word. And at the same trend we can be seeing with Trados. So 4 participants ranked Trados as the fastest, but Trados was actually fastest for 7 participants. So you can see there's a tendency to rank Word as being faster than it actually was. And post-editing and Trados, so the computer, the translation technology tools, are ranked usually as being slower than they actually were. So participants felt the Word was fastest anyways, even if it really wasn't. It was only the fastest for 2 participants. Then we can move on to technical effort, which I measure by number of keystrokes. So this is just how usually technical effort is measured in research of this kind. And so again, this is literally the number of keystrokes that it took each translator for each translation. And you have there an average of 5,000 for Word, 3,700 for Trados, and around 2,300 for post-editing, which means that post-editing resulted in 54% less keystroke than Word, so more than half the technical effort, and 38% less keystrokes than Trados. Now, 20 participants, which is basically all of them, 20 out of 21, used more keystrokes with Word, so they used more technical effort with Word, which is kind of what one could imagine that would be the case. And 17 participants used fewer keystrokes with post-editing, so again, around 80%. Then we also measured cognitive effort, which is usually measured with number of pauses and mean duration of pauses. And this is, again, is literally the pauses between one keystroke and the other, which are usually taken as a sign of cognitive effort, so time spent thinking or about the translation. And the number of pauses, you can see here a different trend than we've seen before. So post-editing usually saved keystrokes and saved time. However, for the pauses, there's less pauses with post-editing. We have 800 there, 1,000 with Trados and 1,200 with Word. So with post-editing, we had 29% less pauses than with Word, and 16% less pauses than Trados. And the highest number of pauses in Word was for 13 participants, so again, more than half. And the lowest number of pauses was in post-editing for 15 participants. Well, I got things twisted, but this is where the trend is inverted actually, because again, we saved pauses. However, when we look at how long the pauses lasted, you can see that on average it was 31 minutes with Word, so 31 minutes out of the total translation times were spent on pauses rather than typing. 20 minutes with Trados, 25 minutes with post-editing. However, when we look at duration, you have an average of 1,500 seconds with Word, 1,600 seconds with Trados, and 1,800 with post-editing. And here, the mean duration of pauses was highest for post-editing for 13 participants, which means even though the number of pauses was more or less the same, slightly less for post-editing, the duration of pauses tend to be longer when people were using post-editing. Which might indicate, again, a change in maybe the process or what happens in translation when people use post-editing in this case. And then I just calculated the post ratio, which is just how the percentage of time of total time spent on posts, and that was kind of constant across all three workflows, so it was around 58 or 60%. And then again, I asked translators in the post-class questionnaire to rank the workflows according to the effort that they thought it took them. And you can see that 11 participants ranked Word as requiring the least effort, but actually 0 participants were measured well according to the measurement I did. Word didn't require the least effort for anyone. And then 8 participants ranked post editing as requiring the least effort, but it actually was the least effort for 17 participants, so more than double. And 5 participants ranked Word as requiring the most effort, but it was actually requiring the most effort for 20 participants out of 21. So again, you can see that trend of people tending to think that Word takes them less time, well, perceiving Word as taking less time and less effort, when in reality, the measurements say something else, which is in itself different, like interesting, and kind of tells you the difference again between research and literary translators' perspective. And this is kind of what the point of our research really is to highlight how different the measurements are and how sometimes the numbers don't really tell us the whole story. And so to summarize so far, post-editing reduced, again, temporal, technical, and cognitive efforts, so require less time, less effort. There's a similar post ratio, but the pauses are longer with post-editing. So maybe this might signify a change in translation process or what translators do when they when they're post-editing rather than translating. And again, Word was perceived as faster and requiring less effort than post-editing. So there's a disconnect with the measurement, and there might be some subjective reasons. Part of it might also be that the tool was maybe new to the participants, especially the post-editing tool is a proprietary tool. It's not available to everyone, so nobody had used the tool before. But at the same time, this is why I interviewed participants as well, to kind of get their part of the story of the process. And some of the themes that came up were, again, the machine translation changes the process from creative to analytical, and you have some quotes here. Some of them told me it's not a creative process anymore, but more of an analytical process. And you might think you're still being creative, but you would be more creative if you hadn't seen a translation before. So again, like kind of the idea of post-editing priming the translator. And in the Word file, there was more room for creative thinking. So people think that if, well, they felt that starting from a blank page somehow was letting them be more creative than having a post-editing the machine translation raw text in front of them. Then another theme that came up was that saving time and saving effort is not really a priority nor ideal for literary translation. It's not something we should aspire to, which kind of is in line with for example, the slow translation manifesto that we've seen before. And so one participant told me the translation needs time and it's air to breathe, or you have to constantly tone it down, pace yourself to make it work and make it good. And you still need several reiterations. So a lot of them told me, even during the experiment, of course, it was just one day. And I know that's a lot of the translators. They were telling me this is not the finished result. I usually, leave it there for a while, come back to it in 2 weeks, and then work on it again. And like that's not a finished translation. And so time is a considerable aspect of literary translation for professionals. And I don't mind the effort of thinking about it myself. So that's the whole point. Some of them told me I actually do literary translation because I have to stop and think and be with the text and absorb it and really understand it. So why would I want to save time on literary translation? And then another thing was the machine translation makes translators lazy or is dangerous for the text, for the quality of the text. So a participant told me one is bound to the sentence, and that's a disaster for literature. So a lot of these tools, well, Trados in particular, were divided into segments, and you work on a segment level, and you have to confirm a segment is semi-translated. And so they're saying, I don't have the whole context. Of course, the text is there, but it's not a page. In Word, I can see the whole thing. The paragraph that comes before, the paragraph that comes after. But in this case, you are focused, even if you don't consciously think about it that way, but you're focused on the sentence and you miss out on the surrounding context. And then there's a temptation to let things stand. So a lot of them told me, well, I looked at the result and it was kind of good enough. The sentence made sense. There was no major mistake. And so I kind of wanted to let it stand. But then I finished the translation, and when I went to reread it, I was like, oh, I would never say that in Dutch. Like, also the language fair was English into Dutch, I forgot to say. But they were saying this does not sound good in Dutch. Actually, I'm ashamed that I let this slip, basically. So they're saying there's a temptation there to kind of leave it as it is. And you spend less time thinking about alternatives. You think, oh yeah, that's about right. Next. So again, this thing of comparing the assignments and going to the next one. And it just feels like it's finished and it's ready. And so they also were mentioning this kind of psychological effect of being like, it looks like it's finished and I don't think about checking it out again. And you're gonna go, yeah, this is fun, this is fast, but at the same time, it feels like I have to be very wary of that and make sure I don't get lazy. And then another theme was that saying computer-aided translation interfere with translators' voices and ownership of the text. So they're saying it's going to be less of a translation. With Word, I'm constantly involved. That's more the difference for me. I'm constantly in charge and involved in the text. And then I say, I don't trust myself because there'll be mistakes I don't see. So this is also kind of related to what we said before, being lazy. Machine translation is dangerous because you let all the mistakes slip. And then there were other themes that I'm not going to look into too much in depth today, but I'm happy to tell you more during the coffee breaks or the Q&A, that there was this divide between highbrow and lowbrow literature. So people were saying, well, I wouldn't translate Sylvia Plath with machine translation, but maybe a crime novel looks quite good for it. Some of them were really impressed with the quality of the machine translation for, again, simple sentences. And then they wanted to retain choice over the tools that they use. So again, what we were saying with Damian before as well. So it's important to them to be like, okay, this machine translation looks good for this text. I would like to use it for this romance novel that I'm translating. But if I'm doing that with David Foster Wallace, I want to be there with the text and I don't want to use machine translation. And so they kind of like having the choice. Some of these tools might be actually helpful, might save time where they need to save time, but it shouldn't be a blanket thing that's kind of applied to the whole process of literary translation. And then they would like to see technology that actually help with syntactical constructions and an archive. Some of them were saying, I know there's huge copyright issues, but it would be nice to have a huge archive of all professionally translated books in Dutch in this case. And they were saying just so I can, like a huge corpus basically, just so I can see how other colleagues have done that before, or to see how not to do it, because a lot of literary translators were look for alternatives. So they're saying, I actually don't want to repeat the same sentence that was there before because we need to be more creative. And then we also have focus groups. I don't have time to go into that too much today. Also because again, it was 2 weeks ago, so the analysis is not finished. But yeah, we did have focus groups, one in Ghent, one in Leiden, with 4 and 3 translators and 1 representative of the industry partner, which you might hear in the future with publications that we are preparing on effort, interviews, and focus groups. Then you will hear more about section analysis of the actual translations that the translators produced from Liva in the next presentation. And then there's also a lot of data on segmentation, technology use that I got on the questionnaires that I would also need to use and publish and make available. And then of course, the project is ending, as you might know by now. So always happy to have, like to develop training, collaborations, suggestions for future work. If you think, I always struggle when saying, that I involve literary translators because I also feel external. I study translation, I study literature, but at the same time, I am not a literary translator. And so it's always hard to come into the field as a researcher. And so if any of you have any, suggestions for how researchers should approach this kind of topic, I'm also open to hear from you. And that was me for today. Thank you so much.